Hi everyone, my name is Marcus and you're watching the Reef Nerd YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk about nitrate and phosphate. So I've been wanting to do this video for quite a long time. There's a lot of content out there about nutrients and about nitrate and phosphate, but I've always found it to be not really giving me the answers that I want. It talks about strategies for dealing with it, and it talks about what nitrate and phosphate are used for in a reef tank, or what they're in excess quantities, what their effects are in reef tanks, but very few articles or videos really get to the crux of what levels should you aim for and when, and what you should do if your levels are rising or falling. So that's what I want to make this video about. I want to give really direct advice to both new and mature reefers, because they're both very different circumstances and have different considerations around specifically about what they should do with their nitrate and phosphate at any given level. So to that end, let's get straight to the point of the video. I'm going to provide some answers. If you have an immature reef tank, and to be specific on how I classify that, if your reef tank is in the range of less than about a year old and is not growing substantial coralline algae, as in if your rocks are not completely purple, then I would classify your tank as immature. So if this is you don't have purple rocks and your tank is a year or less old, in some cases it could even be 18 months old, go off that baseline of, are your rocks purple? Yes, no. If the answer is no, you have an immature reef tank for the purposes of this video. Then this advice is what I would give you. Keep your phosphate between 0.02 parts per million and 0.06 parts per million, and keep your nitrate between 1 and 6 parts per million. If your nitrate is higher in that scale, your phosphate can also be a little bit higher on that scale. If your nitrate is lower on that scale, target your phosphate to also be lower in that scale. Simple as that, right? Well, not really, but there's the answer you might have been looking for if you're going to click off this video right about now. I'm going to go into more detail in a little bit. To answer the other side of the coin, if you have a mature reef tank, as in your rocks are completely purple and your tank is at least a year old or more, then I would say keep your phosphate between 0.02 and 0.12, and keep your nitrate between 2 and 25 parts per million. So the only thing that's really changed there is that I would say that more mature reef tanks over time can handle higher levels of both phosphate and nitrate, as the corals will adapt. They are highly adaptable creatures, and long term there can be strong benefits to having those higher levels of nutrient in a tank that is mature. The downside to those higher levels of phosphate and nitrate is that it can promote algae growth, but that is less common in more mature tanks with really strong coralline coverage. So again, there's the answer to the question, in my opinion, of where you should keep your nitrates and phosphates. Now, if you want to know the why, keep watching, because I'm going to get into a lot more detail around nitrate, phosphate, how it's handled, and what my real thoughts on it are beyond just chasing numbers, which I just gave you. So there are three primary ways that nitrate and phosphate are controlled in a reef tank environment. There's mechanical filtration, there's biological filtration, and there's chemical filtration. So let's start with mechanical, because it's the most simple. This is your roller mat, your filter socks, and your skimmer. More than likely, if you're running any of those pieces of equipment, you're using it for two purposes. One, to remove organic matter from the tank before it has a chance to break down into nitrate and phosphate, and two, to improve water clarity. If it's a skimmer, there's a third benefit, and that's to increase pH by oxygenating the water. Pretty simple, right? But there's one thing in there that I think a lot of reefers don't understand, and that is that mechanical filtration does not remove nitrate or phosphate. Period. It does not, it cannot, it's not how it works. It removes organics before they decompose into free nitrate and phosphate within the water. So that's a key thing to understand. If you already have high nitrates and phosphates, mechanical filtration are a poor way of reducing it. You're only reducing the contributors to high nitrate and high phosphate. You're not actually tackling the nitrate and phosphate itself. So if your tank is not consuming it through one of the other mechanisms, being biological or chemical, then the only way to really remove that nitrate and phosphate is going to be through water changes. The next method I want to talk about is biological filtration of nitrate and phosphate. And this is, in my opinion, the best thing to aim for. If you can achieve the perfect balance purely through biological filtration, there's more benefits than any of the other methodologies, and it should be the goal for many reefers, in my opinion. So the primary methods when we think about biological filtration of nitrate and phosphate is just the ecosystem of your tank. So that's the corals themselves, which consume nitrates and phosphates. It's the biofilm on your rocks. It's the bacteria that inhabits every surface of your tank. And it's the algae, if your tank is full of nuisance algae, or probably a better way to look at it is if you have a refugium, an algae turf scrubber, or a chaetomorpha macroalgae reactor of some type, that algae that you're specifically cultivating in those environments is capable of consuming vast amounts of nitrate and phosphate. And for many reefers, this is the end game of a reef tank. Have enough coral or a large enough and successful enough refugium or algae reactor that all of the nitrate and phosphate or all of the excess nitrate and phosphate in your tank is consumed at the rate that it is contributed via the nutrition that you put in your tank in the form of fish and coral food. Anyone who's watched my channel for a little while will know that I'm a huge proponent of algae turf scrubbers in particular. I ran the Santa Monica Rain 2 for years on my old tank, and on this tank I have a custom-made algae turf scrubber built into the sump by Himalaya, Australia, and I absolutely love it. There's so many benefits to growing macroalgae, such as green hair or turf algae in a turf scrubber. It provides better oxygenation than a skimmer. It's less maintenance than a skimmer. It contributes amino acids and proteins into the water column, which in turn feeds coral. It's natural and biological. Refugiums and turf scrubbers, or algae in general, is very unlikely to drop nitrate and phosphate levels to zero, which is well known now to be bad for reef tanks. Zero should never be the goal. Other methods, such as the mechanical filtration, if they're too effective, can lead to zero nitrates and phosphates, and chemical filtration, which I'll get to in a minute, can also very quickly lead to zero nitrates and phosphates. It's unlikely that biological filtration will do that because it's self-limiting. The biological components, that's living organisms like algae and bacteria, will die before the levels get to zero, and their populations will be controlled, and a balance will usually form. The biggest form of filtration in the category of biological filtration, aside from your live rock and your corals, is just the ability to fill empty compartments of your sump with biological media. So whether that's marine pure bricks or the competitors to marine pure bricks, of which there are hundreds on the market that come in all different shapes and sizes, or it's something a little bit more advanced like the Aquaforest biofill rock, which can be run in just a container in your sump or in a reactor, as I do, or even going to something like Bunnings and getting scoria, washing it thoroughly and forming your own biological media if you want to get really DIY on it. Ultimately, the more surface area and the more biological media you can place in your sump and get active in your tank, the less reliance you will have on either mechanical or chemical filtration. And ultimately, I think that's a really good thing to strive for in almost any reef tank due to that self-limiting factor. They're also the lowest maintenance. You don't need to clean your biomedia once a week. You don't need to harvest algae off your biomedia, and you certainly don't need to go and buy more bottles of chemicals to support your biomedia. The third method of controlling nitrate and phosphate in a tank is chemical. And whilst I don't necessarily recommend chemical filtration in the long term, it is a tool in our arsenal that can really help us in many circumstances. Chemical filtration comes in the form of dosing typically lanthanum chloride as a liquid to reduce phosphates, or carbon dosing to reduce both nitrates and phosphates. Now, carbon dosing is an interesting one because it actually is technically a form of biological filtration, but it's only supported by constantly dosing a carbon source, aka a chemical, into the tank on a continual basis. It also requires a skimmer, otherwise you run the risk of having an algal bloom. Products like Red Sea No-Pox have been on the market for many years now, and a lot of reefers swear by it and have been using it with great success. So I don't think there's really any risk factor associated with carbon dosing that's any higher than any other methodology out there at the moment. And as such, it is something that, if it suits you, for many reefers can be considered. There's also side benefits to carbon dosing in that you are creating a lot of bacteria in your water column, which in turn theoretically will feed coral growth, because much of your coral in your tank will consume bacteria as a form of nutrition. I have two example products here today for chemical filtration. I've got the Phosphate X from Reef Revolution. This is lanthanum chloride, and there's dosage instructions on the bottle. Essentially, lanthanum chloride is a phosphate binder. You add a drop of this, the phosphate in your water will react with the lanthanum. It then precipitates into a solid crystal, microscopic dust we're talking about, which will then either be removed by skimming or settle out in your sand bed. So this is a way of binding phosphate and removing it from the water column that is highly effective. It can be overdosed, so go easy. And of course, when doing any type of chemical filtration, testing is necessary to make sure you're not overdosing. I would treat something like this as a short-term solution. If your phosphates need to be brought down and you want to avoid doing it through substantial water changes, a product like this can be fantastic. It's probably not a good long-term solution though, because it's not treating the ultimate problem that you have, which is that your trend of phosphate addition to the tank is substantially higher than the phosphate consumption supported by the rest of your tank. And relying on something like this to even that curve is probably not a great long-term solution. Unfortunately, there is no equivalent to lanthanum chloride for nitrate, at least not one that I know of that's reef safe. So there isn't a magic liquid you can put in your tank that will specifically target nitrate and will drop it according to an equation like we can do with lanthanum chloride, where it's just a very simple X amount of lanthanum chloride in Y amount of salt water will reduce phosphate by Z, and it's a very simple equation. And we really love that about it. Unfortunately, there's no equivalent for that for nitrate. The other product I have here is Reef Revolution NitraPhos X. This is a carbon source. So ultimately, this will promote bacteria, which in turn consumes nitrate and phosphate at a rapid rate, and that bacteria is then removed by skimming or consumed by your coral in the tank. This is more of a long-term solution. This could be attached to your tank via a dosing pump. Many people have used products like this or similar products from competing brands for many years as their primary form of nitrate and phosphate reduction. And because it's a combination of chemical and biological, I think it does fit well into the category of something that can be used long term. Because carbon dosing results in a biological process, it's much less exact and therefore needs to be monitored pretty closely and dialed in for your specific tank. There is one chemical filtration methodology that I'm aware of that targets specifically nitrate, and that's a sulfur reactor. It's not something I've personally used, and there is a learning curve and a fair bit of setup with sulfur reactors. The consideration with them is that they're almost on par with calcium reactors in terms of complexity. If you want to learn more about sulfur reactors specifically as a long-term nitrate controlling methodology, I won't be able to provide you with that information because I don't have the personal experience to back it up. I'd suggest instead checking out Sam Parker and Parker's Reef. He, I know, runs sulfur reactors and has done for a number of years and has done a fair few videos on them specifically. Another great chemical filtration method for phosphate is GFO, or granular ferric oxide. This is a fine granular media that is dark brown typically, and you run it most often in a reactor, but it can also be run in something like a filter sock. GFO attracts phosphate and binds it to the substrate itself, and therefore you need to remove the GFO and replace it on a semi-regular basis. How often you need to do that really depends, and also how much phosphate you're continually contributing to your tank. But as a ballpark for, say, new reefers, I would typically start with about half a cup of GFO per 200 litres and replace it every 2 to 3 weeks. Of course, test your phosphate levels to validate whether this is necessary. In some circumstances, that might be too aggressive and drop the levels to near zero. In other tanks, it might not nearly be aggressive enough, and you might need substantially more phosphate or need to replace it more regularly. As with most things in reefing, doing something a small amount more frequently is typically a more stable way to run a reef tank than doing a large amount less frequently, but you have to balance that with your own maintenance practices. I also want to touch on the topic of zero nitrate and zero phosphate, or ultra low nutrient tanks as they're sometimes called. I think this trend has gone really out of fashion, and for good reason. Not many people had long-term success running a reef tank like this. And the reason is that it's just too aggressive on the corals. And coral mortality gets really high when you're dealing with levels that are literally undetectable or at zero. Nitrate and phosphate is necessary for coral growth and health. And if it's not present, the corals have a strong tendency to starve if you're not able to provide for their nutritional needs in a very specific way that, in my opinion, is hard to replicate or hard to maintain long term in many reef tanks. There are some methodologies out there that do advocate for an ultra low nutrient tank, the most prevalent being the KZ line of products and methodology. However, they're not particularly popular in Australia and not particularly accessible in Australia as a product line. So it's not something I would recommend. They're also a fairly extensive product line, and you need to make use of their entire methodology and follow the plan completely, I think, in order to get success. It's not something you can do part way. So for that reason, very few reefers, in my experience, have had success with ultra low nutrient tanks long term. Even in my own experience, moving what was a mature reef in my 3-foot Neptunian cube to this brand new reef, being the 6-foot, 600 litre system, even though I moved a completely established live rock and coral into the new tank, which was already cycled, taking bacterial maturity with me, what I was essentially doing in that process was a 100% water change. So my nutrients went from somewhere in the range of 0.08 or 0.09 for phosphate and about 25 ppm for nitrate, all the way to 0.0. And it took me the better part of 3 months to get my nitrates and phosphates to stabilize at where they are today, which is 0.05 on phosphate and about 4 on nitrate. And in that 3 months, my LPS suffered enormously. Even though I was feeding the tank a huge amount, I was feeding this, and still am, feeding this tank 6 times a day on average. It's just not enough in a broadcast feeding methodology for LPS sitting in an ultra low nutrient tank. I was just getting tissue recession everywhere on my hammers, on my torches, on my scullies and trackies, Duncans. All my LPS suffered through the transition. Now, thankfully, I haven't lost too many. There's one head of an orange hammer that I did lose, and I think I'm about to lose a head of one of my green torches. But all in all, I haven't had too much mortality, but they have definitely suffered. And It does take an experienced reefing eye to see when LPS are suffering, but the most common way of identifying it is to look at them at night when they're closed up. The tissue that used to cover the outside of the polyp's head will have receded up and into the septa, which is those hard skeletal lines that sit underneath the flesh on the inside of a large polyp stony coral's head. That is a really bad sign for LPS, and they can survive in that state for a very long time typically, but they are just doing that. They're just surviving. A healthy LPS should have solid tissue growth down the skeleton and around the outside of the elongated skeleton of any branching LPS. The same goes for scalemia and for wall-style euphilia. You want to see that flesh on the outside of the skeleton. If you don't, it's a sign that the LPS is very unhappy. Even if during the day they are puffed up and they look normal to your eyes. And that's the state that my LPS continue to be into this day. I have noticed if tissue recession has slowed or maybe stopped on the majority of them, but until I see that that tissue starts regrowing, I won't actually be happy. And I'm 99.9% positive that it was because of my lack of nutrient in the water, even though it was only a period of 2 to 3 months. That's all it took to essentially recede the exterior flesh on all of those corals by a dramatic amount. In my opinion, the only way, and my biggest regret with moving over to this tank, is that I wasn't specifically target feeding my LPS, and I now understand that that is absolutely necessary for LPS in an ultra low nutrient environment. And it can take quite a lot of time to bring nutrients up. One thing that I really wish I'd done, aside from target feeding those corals, because obviously the broadcasting 6 times a day just wasn't enough for my LPS, was you can dose nitrate and phosphate directly to your tank. And anyone with an ultra low nutrient tank, I would strongly recommend considering that. So to that end, I have 2 more products that I want to show you today. Again, they're by Reef Revolution. This is their Nitrate Plus and their Phosphate Plus. This is essentially nitrate and phosphate in a bottle with really simple instructions in terms of 2 drops per 100 liters will raise the level of nitrate, in this case, by 0.1. And with the phosphate, it's 2 drops per 100 liters will raise the level of phosphate by 0.05. So for most reefers, 1 or 2 drops of this per day, if they're dealing with an ultra low nutrient tank per 100 liters, is all that would be required to maintain levels suitable for the majority of coral. A product like that is really outstanding for that reason. The reason I like and want to highlight the Reef Revolution nitrate and phosphate products at this time is that they are by far the most concentrated on the market. So they just represent really good value. 2 drops of those products are equivalent to 10 drops of some of their competitor products. And I think that's a really good thing for any reefer out there looking to save a buck. The only reason I wouldn't recommend these is if you have a really small tank. So 100 liters or less, these might be actually too strong for your needs. So we've covered an awful lot in this video. I've given you numbers you can shoot for depending on whether you have a new tank or a mature tank, but I really want to stress that chasing numbers is generally not the way to think about how you should be treating your reef tank. You should be chasing a trend, and you want that trend to be as slow and stable as possible. So identify whether your nitrate and phosphate is increasing or decreasing, and then react accordingly in order to flatten that trend or maybe nudge it in the direction that you want. Don't react in order to say, reduce your nitrate from Y to X. You want to reduce or increase the trend, because that's what's going to be leading to stability, and that's what's going to lead to long-term success. Simply dramatically adjusting where your levels are in a short period of time, but then doing nothing to the underlying cause of whatever trend caused them to get to that number in the first place is never going to lead to success. So yeah, there's a lot to understand with nitrate and phosphate. It is a pretty complicated topic, and I hope I've been able to shed some light into my thinking of it and give you an overview of all the different ways it can be managed in a reef tank. My recommendation is always to try biological first. Make the absolute, make use of all of the empty space in your sump, fill it with bioremedias, and attempt to get as stable a nitrate and phosphate level as you can before you then rely on either chemical or mechanical filtration. Of course, most of us run mechanical and chemical filtration on our tanks, but you want to reduce your reliance on it as much as possible. And that's why I say to target the biological methods first. Anyway, that's all for today. If you've got any specific questions around nitrates and phosphates, post them in the comments down below. I'd be happy to share my opinions and thoughts on anything around this topic down there. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel. My name is Marcus, and you've been watching the Reef Nerd YouTube channel. Bye for now.